Edward II went from king to prisoner, wasting away in a cell until he died. Afterward, a vicious rumor spread about how he'd been found, and it was truly gruesome. There have been some infamous kings throughout history, but I guarantee that few rulers caused as much drama as King Edward II. This problem child of the English throne grew into one of the shadiest, most vengeful, and unstable monarchs his country ever saw. And wow, did he ever pay the price for it. People were very excited about Edward's birth. Even though Edward was only the fourth son of the famous King Edward Longshanks and his wife Eleanor, prophets of the time predicted that he would become a just, powerful ruler akin to King Arthur. But this was definitely not the legacy that Edward left. Although Edward supposedly lived a charmed life as a prince, his childhood was riddled with horrors. Not only did he barely get to know his mother, Eleanor, who was away for most of his formative years and dead for the rest. 3 of his elder brothers had already passed before he even reached his first birthday. As Edward turned into an adolescent, he morphed into a strapping lad in the classic Plantagenet mode, the ancestral house of his father. He was tall, muscular, and good-looking, and took an avid interest in horses and dogs, particularly greyhounds. Yet, for all these common medieval accomplishments, Edward had more controversial interests. Around 1300, when Edward was still an impressionable 16-year-old, his father introduced him to a new companion, the brawy nobleman Piers Gaveston. Little did the king know, this kick-started a permanent twist of fate. Edward soon became best buddies with Gaveston, with some even suggesting they became literal blood brothers. But this was far from all. Although it's impossible to verify for sure, there is some very convincing evidence that at some point during their bromance, Edward and Gaveston became actual lovers. One contemporary source revealed that Edward felt such love for Gaveston that he entered into a covenant of constancy with him. To be fair, it was hard for Edward not to be attracted to Gaveston. He was a notably talented fighter, and people called him arrogant and ostentatious, as well as reckless and headstrong. In other words, he was a deliciously toxic hunk of a man. How could a hormonal teen resist? In 1307, Edward's father dealt him a cruel blow. For reasons that are still mysterious to this day, the king booted Piers Gaveston right out of court, exiling him to Gasconany. I wonder if this had anything to do with the fact that the prince and his hunky sidekick were getting far too close. Still, Edward had another worry on his mind. Even when Edward was gallivanting around with Piers, he wasn't a free man. Ever since he was an infant, his parents had betrothed him to the even younger Princess Isabella of France. The betrothal was strictly a business deal, and Edward's parents just wanted to make an advantageous political alliance. To speak plainly, Edward and Isabella were downright doomed from the start. For one, even Edward's own father, a.k.a. the guy who set the whole thing up, quickly wanted out of the betrothal and spent years trying to wriggle his son free so that he could make a better match. No matter how hard he tried, though, it never worked. And then, suddenly, it all came crashing down. In 1307, the old king died, turning Edward into the brand-spanking new king of England at a mere 23 years old. Want to know what his first move as king was? No, it wasn't to finally marry his fiancée, Isabella. It was to bring his precious Piers Gaveston back to court. Unfortunately for Edward, this was a spectacularly bad idea. Gaveston was a major distraction for the new king. Like every bad boyfriend, Piers somehow drove the king into horrible decisions whenever he was around. Case in point, in 1308, Edward traveled to France to meet his 12-year-old bride, Isabella, at long last. But to the outrage of all his courtiers, he made Gaveston the de facto ruler of England in his absence. This was the first in a long line of dismal choices. On January 25, 1308, King Edward II and Isabella finally married in northern France. it quickly turned into an utter disaster. In a disturbing omen for their entire marriage, Edward decided not to sit next to his child bride at the ceremony, but cozied up to Gaveston instead. The snub insulted Isabella's entire family in one fell swoop. Oh, and there's a kicker. According to a prevalent rumor at the time, Piers Gaveston wasn't content with taking Isabella's man on her big day. He also took her belongings. The new child queen received lavish gifts as wedding presents, and some whispered that Gaveston purloined them right out of her hands. Edward II and Gaveston were really into each other during this time. So much so that the people would quip that there were two kings reigning in one kingdom. Edward would even give Gaveston his wife's jewelry, and then the courtier would smugly show off the baubles, making sure the queen saw who was wearing her new jewels. As it turns out, Edward II was about as good of a king as he was a husband. One of the reasons Gaveston was his favorite was because Edward hated making decisions and would rather leave the grunt work of running a kingdom to someone else. As one commenter put it, Edward was incompetent and vicious, and no man of business. In the months following their wedding, Edward's behavior toward Isabella didn't improve. Actually, it did the exact opposite. Edward all but ignored his wife, preferring instead to take up with a series of mistresses. So little Isabella had to get very smart very fast. As Isabella grew up, she made a surprising decision. Perhaps realizing that she could never compete with Gaveston, she teamed up with him. The pair became close allies, and in the process, Isabella earned just a tiny bit of attention from King Edward, who finally started treating her like an actual human being. Yet, just as Edward's personal life seemed like it was calming down, destiny came in and smashed it with a sledgehammer. Edward II's infatuation with the handsome Piers Gaveston didn't just alienate his wife, it alienated his whole country. Soon enough, his barons made actual real laws banning Gaveston from Edward's presence, exiled him several times, and tried desperately to limit his power. Then, it all came to a gruesome climax. In the summer of 1312, Edward's enemies hatched a gut-wrenching plan. His discontented baron captured Gaveston, and before Edward could come to his rescue, they tried and executed the courtier. It was not a good end. The men took Gaveston out to a deserted road, chopped off his head, and left his body there. When Edward heard about his favorite dark fate, he went right off the deep end. Outraged, the furious king swore vengeance on the rogue barons who executed Gaveston, and England barely avoided a civil war over the plot. Not that it was all's well that ends well. This one act of rebellion was a sign of far worse things to come. Around this time, Edward's luck turned dismal. In addition to his personal issues, he also had been waging battles against Robert the Bruce and the Scottish. In 1314, the king suffered a hugely embarrassing defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn, and on top of that, a famine started raging across England. Edward's response to this dilemma was infamous. Things were so bad at this point, people were writing poems with titles like The Evil Times of Edward II. So, what does the king do? If you guessed beat back the Scottish or feed his people, you'd be wrong. Instead, Edward found himself another favorite, striking up an alliance with Hugh Despenser the Younger. Somehow, this romance would end even more tragically than the one before. No one was happy about this development, especially not Edward's wife. In the intervening years, Queen Isabella had gone from a naive girl to a powerhouse of a ruler, even giving her husband, a son and heir, baby Edward, in 1312. And where Isabella had tolerated Piers Gaveston, she outright despised this upstart Hugh Despenser. You know what they say? Unhappy wife, really horrifically unhappy life. Soon enough, word got out about Hugh Despenser, and it was like the Gaveston scandal all over again. But this time, it went to a whole new level. People left, right? and sent her accuse the king and his new favorite of carrying on an affair, with one later commenter saying Edward loved Hugh dearly with all his heart and mind. Unwilling to go down this road again, the courtiers threatened abdication and forced Edward to exile Hugh and his whole family right off the bat. On the surface, King Edward complied with the baron's demands, but he was hiding a deep secret. He wasn't cowed in the slightest. Indeed, practically the minute that Hugh Despenser waved goodbye and set off for exile, Edward started plotting his revenge. In order to avenge Hugh and provoke his enemies, Edward used his own wife, Isabella, as bait, sending her into a hostile castle as a guest. When surprised, the inhabitants attacked the queen's entourage, Edward had all the excuse he needed to bombard his foes without blame, except for the part where, he used his wife as bait. After this lovely show of marital fidelity, the king regained control of his vassals, brought Hugh Despenser and his brood back to court, and executed all of his naysayers. Then he turned his attention on Isabella, as for some reason the Despensers suspected her of endless plots, and Edward was happy to play along. But it was Edward himself who dealt her the cruelest blow. By 1324, Isabella and King Edward's relationship had deteriorated beyond repair, and Edward sure let her know it. Partly using rising tensions with France as an excuse, he confiscated all of Isabella's lands, took over the household, and threw her French staff behind bars. As a rotten cherry on top, he then ripped the queen's children from her while they were feeding and dumped them with the Despenser clan to get a better childhood. Is it any wonder Isabella got her husband back so brutally? King Edward III obviously didn't think ahead too well, because not a year later he needed Queen Isabella to do him a big solid. In 1325, with a war now fully broken out between England and France, he sent his wife back to her native land to butter up her brother, King Charles III of France. The goal was to bring the conflict to a swift end. Isabella smiled, nodded her head, and went obediently to do Edward's bidding, or so he thought. Edward might have been notoriously good at getting revenge, but Isabella had learned a thing or two from her husband. By September of the same year, Isabella's teenage son, Prince Edward, had joined her in France, and that's when she pounced. Holed up in enemy territory with the heir to the English throne, Isabella's plan kicked into gear. First, she refused to come back to her husband, and then phase 2 began. Suddenly, for the first time in years, King Edward was very concerned about his wife. He sent her frantic letter after frantic letter demanding that she come back. But her brother, King Charles, simply responded that the Queen has come here of her own will and may return freely if she wishes. But if she prefers to remain here, she is my sister, and I refuse to expel her. And then the news grew worse for Edward. Since Isabella wasn't coming home any time soon, Edward got his emissaries to keep an eye on her actions in the French court. Their messages made his blood run cold. Apparently, the Queen was gathering support by dramatically dressing in black mourning clothes and claiming Hugh Despenser had destroyed her marriage. Then somehow, she outdid herself again. By February 1326, King Edward's long-suffering wife was thoroughly done with him, and her final nail in the coffin shot right through his heart. While over in France, Isabella started up an affair with the handsome English courtier Roger Mortimer, who just so happened to be one of Edward's exiled foes. Yep, Isabella was literally sleeping with the enemy, and big trouble was brewing. Before the year was even out, Queen Isabella and her man Mortimer had turned into the 14th century power couple. All of Edward's enemies, and there were many, flocked to the French court. As if that weren't enough, Isabella then betrothed her son, Prince Edward, to the daughter of a wealthy count in exchange for an armada of warships. Sure, King Edward was a little distracted with Hugh Despenser, but even he could see what was going on with Isabella over in France, and it made him quake in his boots. To put it plainly, His arranged wife and her lover were clearly going to invade his kingdom and try to boot him off the throne. In late September of 1326, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer landed on English soil and proceeded to pummel the armies of King Edward II. By early November, Edward and his favorite Hugh Despenser were on the run, and by the middle of the month, the vengeful Queen's forces had captured and imprisoned them. Then things got truly dark. Now that Edward and Isabella were officially over, his consort wasted no time showing him who was boss. She started by hitting him where it hurt most, her old rival, Hugh Despenser. With extreme prejudice, Isabella sentenced the man to execution on November 24, 1326, and the details live on in infamy. When she sentenced Hugh, Isabella decided he should be disemboweled, castrated, and then quartered. But then it got even more intense. The massive crowd that turned up to Hugh's execution also watched as people wrote biblical verses about corruption and arrogance all over his bare skin. Then, when all was said and done, they hung his limp body. With that little chore taken care of, Isabella turned her attention on her husband. While Hugh got hanged, Edward II was holed up as a prisoner in Kenilworth Castle. Technically, he was no longer a threat, but Edward presented a big problem. No one was quite sure what to do with a king who so obviously wasn't king anymore, at least not in any practical way. Eventually, a group of high-ranking nobles paid him a visit and gave him a cruel ultimatum. In order to officially transfer power, the nobles browbeat their monarch into abdication. They let Edward know in no uncertain terms that unless he gave his crown to Prince Edward, it would go to another candidate, and his royal line would be extinguished forever. With no choice, a tearful Edward agreed to the terms. Unfortunately for the aristo monarch, none of this would save him from his own tragic fate. Edward spent the next long year alone and imprisoned, and there is evidence to suggest his captors mistreated their former ruler. To make matters worse, loyalists kept trying to jailbreak the captive, forcing Isabella and Mortimer to have Edward constantly moved around from castle to castle to avoid the would-be saviors. And then Edward's final nightmare began. On September 21, 1327, attendants found Edward's body cold, stiff, and lifeless in his cell. Edward, who was only 43 at the time, had suffered from a deep depression throughout his imprisonment and hadn't received top-notch care. However, there didn't seem to be anything seriously wrong with him, which led to some unsettling whispers. Historians have noted that King Edward's passing was suspiciously timely in that it solved all the political complications of having him be well alive. So instead of natural causes, historians suggest a much darker reason for his demise. His wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover Roger Mortimer likely ordered him to be assassinated. As for how it all went down, this is where the story gets extremely grim. Although we can never know what King Edward II's final moments on Earth were really like, one particular rumor about his demise is mind-blowingly ugly and spiteful. As the years wore on, people started claiming his assailants off him by sticking a red-hot poker up his rectum, which was an obvious allusion to his assumed sexuality. Historians, however, have largely debunked this. Not only is it clearly a derogatory dig at his presumed bedroom preferences, it's also not the best way for undercover assassins to claim the king died a natural death. Ridiculously enough, the story does get stranger. During his reign, Edward was vain, arrogant, and not a man to be crossed. Not the best combination of qualities. In 1323, Edward was in a total stalemate with Robert the Bruce and the Scottish forces. So, one of his best advisers, Andrew Harclay, attempted to broker a peace treaty that would name Robert King of Scotland and end the suffering of thousands. How do you think Edward II responded to that? Furious that a lackey would so much as suggest he give up one of his royal titles, King Edward immediately had Harlay executed, then displayed his head in London for all to see. The most ironic part of this gruesome tale, soon after Edward agreed to a 13-year truce with Robert the Bruce, ending up in much the same place. Anyway, as for his family, well, karma comes for us all. Even though Isabella was a bit justified in, well, rising against and then murdering her own husband, she got her comeuppance too. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer fell apart almost instantly after Edward's passing, and she became merely the queen mother to her son, King Edward III, in the years to follow. In an irony to end all ironies, however, Edward II's heart was later buried beside Isabella's body. Not what I think the guy or Isabella would have wanted. When someone famous kicks the bucket, there are always spurious conspiracy theories claiming they're still alive. But in the case of Edward II, it might really be true. The now famous Fieschi letter written by the Italian priest Manuel Fee claims Edward actually escaped, and that the body in his cell was a humble porter. In this version of events, the fugitive king fled to the Holy Roman Empire to live out the rest of his days as a hermit. Even more shockingly, multiple historians confirm that some or all of the letter is true. As for the oft-repeated stories of royals escaping their gruesome fates, Edward II might have actually pulled it off, but of course, we can never know for sure. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to Keep Exploring with Us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factate, for more incredible facts about everything.